Welcome back to the channel, and in this video, part 3 of 3, we're going to continue our series looking at rebuilding the Ribcase 1275 gearbox as fitted to MG Midget, Austin Healey Sprite, and also can be fitted into a Morris Minor. In part 2 then, we cleaned all our assemblies, we put them together ready for the main assembly, in which case we're now ready to go on rebuilding the gearbox to its final condition. Cleanliness is paramount here then, so we've got all our parts laid out, our cases have been thoroughly cleaned and degreased, so we're in a great place ready to start assembling. In terms of the process we're going to follow then, it's quite well documented. We can loosely assemble beforehand the reverse gear into the carrier location here, and also our lay gear in its place at the back, and that will give us access then to position our main shaft, our main gear set shaft through here, and locate that into the input shaft. The main gear set won't go in with the lay gear and the reverse gear in place, so once the main gear set is in place, we can fit the lay shaft across the back, we can fit the reverse gear in its location here, and then from there on in it's quite straightforward. It's getting all the balls and plungers in place, so we'll show you how to put those back in the right sequence to make sure they're all there. That occupies these holes and these locations here, and then we'll put the main gear selector levers back in sequence coming through here and connect those up to the gear set. From there on in, it's the rear case, it's the remote housing, and of course checking everything works correctly along the way. Before we can assemble our input shaft then into the main case, the first thing we have to do is drop in our lay gear, and the reason for that is if you put the input shaft in first, then you won't be able to get the lay gear in. So what we do now, we've got our new bearings in place, is we'll drop the lay gear into place together with the washers that go either end. So on doing the measurements, we need 3 thou of play between the lay gear and the case. You can buy different shims to allow that to be spaced. I have the largest shims available already and a 4 thou gap, so I'm happy with that. And we're going to drop the lay gear into place. Then at that point we can go and put the input shaft in. Next thing we can do is fit the input shaft. So to fit the input shaft, I'm going to drop the lay gear down out of the way. I'm going to put the input shaft in the freezer and then use a heat gun around the main case, and then we can take the input shaft in through the aperture and pull the bearing through so that the slot on the bearing just about breaches the hole, so we can get the circlip on. Now we can fit the circlip onto the bearing, and then we'll use a drift to drift that back down. So now with our input gear in, got our lay shaft tucked away, and something I've done here is use just a thin metal rod to make sure that the washers don't fall out of place, and I can lift it back up to put the shaft back in place. going to take the reverse idler gear and just drop that in here. So again, that can be fitted easily, but it's out the way for the next stage, which is going to be to put the main gear set back in. In order to do that then, I'm going to put a line on the main case here. So where the gap is, and then on this casing I'm going to put another line, so when I'm fitting that I can match that up. There we go. Okay. Okay, so holding from the inside to make sure third and fourth don't drop off. That wouldn't be good. Take the gear set past reverse, feed it into the first gear thrust washer. Just tip the reverse gear up so that it doesn't get trapped. Turn and align the outside casing and push in. Well, that went in easier than I thought. So with the main gear set in place now, next thing to do is get the reverse in place. So we've got our shaft here. Just give that a quick clean. Got our shaft here, so we can drop that in, and we need to make sure that the hole in the shaft aligns with the hole in the gearbox. Then we can use our screw to locate that into position. So now with reverse in place, now the more complex task of getting the layshaft back into place. So I've got my rod going through, so I know my washers are roughly in place. We're going to push the layshaft through and see if we can get that in. So the layshaft is now fitted in. I definitely found it easier to fit this way up with the layshaft on the top. Gravity's then on my side, pulling the layshaft down into the gear set, rather than having to try and lift it or hold it up in some way. So definitely recommended to put the gearbox round this way. So temporarily now I've dropped a cover onto the front, and that's to stop the layshaft falling out, because I'm going to be turning the gearbox on its end so that we can sort out the rear bearing assembly. Next job I'm going to do then is I'm going to put the rear cover over the top here, and that's so that I can get this pin to interlock with the rear cover, and then adjust the cover, rotating this mounting plate so that the mounting holes align, and then I know this plate is in the right position. And then, if you remember, I haven't tapped down this bearing yet. There's still a little bit of a gap down to the datum stop with the circlip sitting on the bottom, so I'll be able to tap that down. Right, so that's our gear set effectively back in the gearbox now. Next thing to do then is to start looking at the selector rods and the mine melt, which is putting all the little balls and springs back in to match these detents here. First up then is the reverse selector rod. Looks like this, identifiable because there's a kind of 90-degree hole here to the vertical surface as it's facing this way, because the location screw for this selector is accessible through this hole here, so that must align with that. So that goes into this bottom hole here, so I'm going to be sliding that through there, and when it goes into the gearbox, the reverse selector goes into the slot that's on the reverse gear, so it'll sit vertically, allowing me to access this screw hole, this locking screw, through this hole here. So one thing to note here is, as putting in the reverse shaft, we need to locate the third and fourth gear selector into the gearbox here. So actually, before I put that on there, I'm going to give that a liberal coat of oil on there before encapsulating that. So now we can put our third and fourth gear selector in, as the reverse shaft goes through that. So once we've got that in place, we can then put the screw in and tighten that up. So now on to the first of our plungers, and this one is a double-ended bullet type, and this one actually sits between the two shafts up here, so you have to put it into this hole here on the top of the gearbox and push it down past the top selector rod so that it sits in a gap between the top one and the bottom one. So we'll give that a liberal coating of oil and just drop that into there, and then use the pin to push that all the way down through the first hole so that it sits on top of the reverse shaft that I've just put in. Okay, there we go. So when it's in, you can actually see it just sitting there in between these two shafts. Next up then is the first and second selector rod, so that's this rod, and we're going to be pushing that into this hole here. So what we're going to be doing is sending that all the way through and putting it through the first and second selector here, sending it through and then tightening that screw onto here. Interestingly, in order to get that through, we've got to get this shaft past that ball. So what it means is we're going to have to pull this shaft into a position where that plunger drops down into its detent to allow this shaft to go in. Next up we've got two interlock balls, and this is where gearboxes become witchcraft. In here there are cross drillings, and the balls are effectively going to sit between the final shaft that we're going to put in and the first two that we've already put in, so here and here within the casting. So to put these in, they need to go into, let's have a look, this hole here on the top of the casting, and also this hole. So these two holes are where these balls are going to go in, and we want gravity on our side for this, so I'm going to put this side of the gearbox vertical to allow those two balls to go down the channels in the right place. We're going to oil up the channels and then use a long thin prod to prod those balls all the way down to interlock with the shafts. So I've turned the gearbox around now. Note it's facing the other way, and I'm going to be putting a ball in here and a ball in here. So a little bit fiddly, the balls. I feel like a bit of a heart surgeon, but you can probably just make out one sitting the other side of that hole there. And if I come around, see if I can get a look down that hole, you can probably just make out the two balls are down there in their two holes either side of this shaft aperture. Finally then we can put the last selector rod in, and there's only one hole left to go in, so that will go into this hole here, and that will slide through, locate itself in the selector here for third and fourth, and then be pushed through past those balls into the other side, and then we can do this screw up here. Now we can fit the next set of plungers in. So first of all, we've got a plunger, a spring and a securing screw, and that's going to go into this one closest to the front of the bell housing on the side of the engine here. So put that in, put the screw in, and we can screw that down. See what size that is. That's 9/16 by the looks of it. Particularly tight. There's not really much load on these at all, so just nip those up so they're not going to come undone. And then next up we have this piece which goes into here, that seals the shaft. Levers are now returned to the gearbox then, and now's a good time to try selecting all the gears. I've just done that on this gearbox, made sure all of the gears work and actuate by the levers. You should be able to do that. So by pulling this out, you're going to get first, pushing it in, you're going to get second. The middle lever, again pulling it out, third, in, fourth, and then pushing the bottom lever in, you're going to get reverse. You should be able to select those okay and rotate the shafts accordingly, which I've done on this, so I'm happy that the gearbox does work as it should do. Next thing then is I can move on to the front cover, and this gearbox is going to get a revised front cover. This one has had an oil seal modification on the front. The scroll seal on the original had worn quite badly and therefore wasn't reusable, so I've gone for the upgrade. This is not too expensive an upgrade and well worth doing. But before I can fit that, I need to measure the gasket. I need to measure the distance from the bearing off the face here, the recess that I have in my front cover, and the difference between all of that may mean I need to fit a bearing shim into here. So the idea is once it's all clamped up, that bearing will be clamped tightly into the casing hard, up against the casing with the circlip that's fitted in the bearing, therefore meaning it can't go anywhere. So we're going to measure that up and see if I need a shim. So based on those calculations, I'm going to fit this 0.1 millimeter shim, and I think that should be about right. So finally I can tighten up all of these nuts to, I'm using just over 6 Newton meters. So with the front cover now on the gearbox, we can move to the rear cover. Right, so now we're on to the rear housing and the fitting of that. So first thing we've got to do is also measure up the bearing like we did with the front cover, measure up the gasket that we're going to put on and see if we need any shims, so that when we put the rear cover on, the bearing is clamped nice and tight. Based on my measurements then, I've got a 0.1 millimeter shim. I'm going to be fitting that into this recess, holding it in with a little bit of grease for when I insert the housing over the main case. In preparation for the main case, one of the challenges here is getting the remote selector into this gap. So what I've done here is I've released back this changer for, which gear is it? It's for first gear by the looks of it, and moved the shaft out a bit, so you can see there's a little bit of a gap created here, so my selector can come into here and then locate in here, and then once the housing is on, I'll be able to just release that, twist the shaft back to close this gap up, and then retighten that screw. So that's how I'm going to make an easy job of getting the selector into here. All that remains then before I can attach it on is to put a new gasket on here. We've got a new gasket to go on, and I'm going to use a very thin smear of well seal just to give that a little bit of a surface to stick to, and then we can fit the main rear housing. The rear housing in place then, we've got our selector located correctly in the gear selector slots. We've readjusted and corrected our selector pin screw, so that's located correctly, Next up then, all we need to do is tighten up all the bolts to secure the rear housing on. Next up then, in the rear case, we've got the speedometer housing, and we've also got the screw here that we use for topping up the oil. So I'm going to get that back in. Next up then, the side cover, I'm going to put that on, and this is where we put the last of our 2 plungers into the gearbox, and these go into these 2 holes here. So I'm going to drop a little bit of oil on there to lubricate their passage down, and then we can drop 2 plungers in here, and then also here. And on top of those go 2 springs. Okay, so when we put top cover on, what we're going to do is be pushing those 2 springs down to push the plungers down onto the selector rods which they're associated with. So we're nearly there with our gearbox now. Last thing to do is fit the remote housing over here, which should just be a straightforward job of fitting this over the top of here. What I'm going to just make sure is that this aperture here has got some grease in it so that the plastic collar can fit and slide smoothly within that. Other than that, it's just a case of bolting it onto the top. With the remote housing on then, that's our gearbox nearly finished. Just a few things to do here. We've had to put the seal on, put the cap on for the starter motor. We've got a rear seal here. I've put the oil plug in the bottom of the gearbox. So a few little bits and pieces that go on the outside really to make it complete. The last job then is to get the selector lever in place and screw down the cap on the top. And with our lever in place, that brings us to the end of our gearbox journey. Maybe we can just test the gears. So there we've got first, second, third and fourth. If we knock the gear over, that's reverse. So that's our gearbox complete. When the gearbox does get fitted to a car for testing, I'll look to post a part 4 so we can see how it works in the actual car. I hope that this series of videos has showing you what's involved in taking apart this gearbox and putting it back together again. I hope it's given you the confidence to have a go yourself, and as you can see, it's actually not that difficult and can be done at home with garage tools. So once again, thank you for your comments, thanks for subscribing, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.